Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of American cultural history. We've been discussing the rise of participation in sports in the decades following the Civil War and leading up to the turn of the century. In previous lectures, we've talked about sport for the upper class and middle classes, and in this lecture we're going to focus on sport for the working class. In the period prior to the Civil War, the antebellum era, working class sports still revolved around the male bachelor subculture, which we talked about in a previous lecture. These activities involved mostly single men and revolved around the pub or the bar, including things like blood sports and boxing, animal baiting and billiards, lots of gambling, and mingling with loose women. The increased immigration and urbanization of the post-Civil War era in some ways hindered sports for the working class. Working hours became even longer and more dreary, and leisure time was limited. There were fewer open spaces for things like baseball, running, and other sports as the cities became incredibly crowded and paved over. Workmen who came in late or were overly tired could be fired without cause, so workers hesitated to risk any injury from participating in sports. In some cases, relationships with their coworkers suffered in the dreary factory setting. And traditional rural festivals and holidays associated with the agricultural lifestyle were done away with, leaving fewer opportunities for sport. And finally, so-called blue laws in many parts of the country restricted activities that were available on Sunday, which was often the only day that workers had off. And so in many places, sports were banned during the only time that many workers could have participated in them. Despite these challenges and limitations, working class men still managed to find opportunities for entertainment and participating in sports. The largest category in working class sport continued to revolve around the saloon, this bachelor subculture. It was nicknamed, ironically, the poor man's club, and in some cases did develop into quasi-gymnasiums. The largest saloons might have handball courts, billiard rooms, bowling alleys, and dartboards. Less common, though not entirely extinct, were the animal pits and gambling rooms of some of the antebellum era. Cockfighting, for instance, continued to be popular in the South, and in Western mining camps, regulations were rarely enforced. Taverns continued to be the center for the boxing crowd. Patrons could pick up various newspapers describing the boxers and their bouts, and promoters hung flyers like wallpaper on the walls. Saloon back rooms continued to host prize fights, which were illegal in most locales in the late 19th century, but such rules were often overlooked. Boxing was an ideal sport for the lower class, allowing them to prove their bravery, strength, prowess, and honor. The saloon was also a popular site for gamblers, and the bookmaker became an institution in such places, and in some cases remains so even to this day. Not all blue-collar sports activity revolved around the saloon. Some laborers participated in track and field events. Usually at annual picnics sponsored by their employers, union, benevolent society, ethnic organization, or political party, there might be some organized track and field events or races. Eventually, ethnic track clubs began to surface, which became another mechanism for maintaining ethnic identity and solidarity. Unions, which were growing in the post-Civil War era, and especially by the 1880s, hosted many picnics and events. Labor Day and July 4th became favorite labor holidays, featuring many sporting events, races, games, and baseball. These events kept alive a sense of community and social life. Keep in mind that their working conditions are abysmal, and their lives were generally pretty miserable, so any opportunity for outdoor excitement and fun was a welcome one. Now, a handful of these blue-collar workers were able to achieve success on the professional running circuit. Prize races were held as early as the 1830s and became common by the 1850s. The top racers won sponsors and competed in much the same way as horse races, traveling from town to town and competing in stakes races. Frequently, these races were accompanied by huge betting among spectators and participants alike. There were many scandals, and racers suspected of tanking and other kinds of trickery. There was also the growing appeal of the unknown, a ringer who might upset the local favorite, a stranger from out of town. By the 1880s, sprinting had declined as a spectator sport and became instead a favorite activity at amusement parks and fairs. Anyone could pay a nickel and hop onto the track for a race. And even to this day, racing in this informal fashion is a popular event at all kinds of fairs and festivals in the country. Eventually, this interest in track and field events became to develop a more organized kind of sporting culture. Lower-class runners flocked to racing meets, which might offer $75 or $100 for the winner, and they often proceeded through several heats into the final championship round. Prizes were often offered up by local politicians or neighborhood favorites, saloon keepers, and the like. This was relatively cheap advertising and could capture a large audience in ready fashion. A related development was the popularity of the 6-day marathon. How far could a man walk or run in 6 days? You might wonder that yourself. Well, the answer, by 1890, the record for a 6-day marathon was 619 miles. So a person would average more than 100 miles a day over 6 days. The central promoter of this curious sport was Daniel O'Leary, an Irish immigrant who had achieved enough success in his own walking career in the 1870s to invest in it later. O'Leary staged marathons in many cities, and by the 1880s it had become a spectator favorite. Spectators could pay 25 cents for admission and could stay for the entire 6 days if they liked, or come and go as they pleased. It was the 6-day marathon that elevated Madison Square Garden to the premier site for track competitions. The garden had been built in 1874 by P.T. Barnum as a site for chariot races as a sideshow for his circus. By the 1880s, it came to be used for these 6-day marathons. The marathons became popular in modernizing sport. It was easy to keep times and records, and the chase for the 6-day record became a sought-after event in that era. Now, such spectacles as these had broad appeal within the working class, but achieved only limited success with middle-class spectators, as I described in the previous lecture, and were looked upon with absolute scorn by the upper classes. Ethnic clubs also began to spring up around other sports, and particularly baseball, which in the late 1800s was becoming very popular among the working classes. As industrialization increased, companies began to sponsor athletics within their own employee base. There might be thousands of employees within a single factory. And baseball became one of the popular sports within these company or factory sports. There were many reasons why a factory owner or businessman might sponsor sports among his own workers. They promoted morale and their firm's public image if the firm's team could win local tournaments. They might also attract new workers who were drawn to the fascination with sport and these teams. It might also be a way for the manager to weaken unions because it gave them less things to complain about. It encouraged loyalty to the company and also taught the athletes proper values and punctuality, time management. They also might keep taxes down as cities didn't have to pay for facilities and so on. And of course, they were also a way to help keep the workers healthy and fit. One model of the industrial community was the town of Pullman on the outskirts of Chicago. This was established in 1881 by George Pullman, the maker of rail cars. Pullman offered quality housing, good schools, and clean streets for their workers. They offered Sunday concerts, a library, and also sports programs. In 1882, the company founded the Pullman Athletic Association, which was open to all employees. The most popular sports at that time were cricket and crew, and particularly stress was placed on team sports. Similar programs were adopted by many other companies, including U.S. Steel, National Cash Register, and later by the Ford Motor Company. By 1920, granted this is a few decades down the road, but by 1920, Ford workers in Dearborn, Michigan, enjoyed a 20-acre athletic park with football fields, baseball, and tennis. In the early 1900s, industrial teams also contributed to the rise of professional football. Some of the earliest pro football teams, including the Packers of Green Bay, were company teams. What about sport for working class women? Well, working class sport was largely a male sphere. Working class women had virtually no time for sport. They worked, and when not working, they took care of the kids and the home. Still, there were always some women with the inclination to participate in sport. They risked ridicule and often absorbed it. Working class sportswomen were seen as somewhat bizarre entertainment. They tended to gravitate towards manly contests, and events such as women boxing matches and foot races were viewed with relish by voyeuristic men. Just as freakish were a spate of women's wrestling matches, weightlifting contests, or even log rolling events that drew boisterous crowds in the 1880s. There's almost a vaudevillian element to these women participating in sports because part of what was so enjoyable for male spectators was seeing women completely turn on its head the traditional and proper gender roles. At times, working class women also played baseball. There were numerous touring teams, and sometimes they played against men. But typically, these teams had a bad reputation, and rumors swirled around them. Most were thought to be prostitutes taking advantage of this time on the road. So, as we've seen in these previous lectures, sports becomes one of the best and most popular ways for the various social classes to distinguish themselves from each other. The sports of the upper class elites were not available to the middle classes, and middle class sports were not available to the lower